Greetings and welcome. This session features a panel of editors and authors from Water Resources Research, which is the Hydrology section's journal. And so we decided maybe in this alternate format opportunity that it would be great to have a celebration of that. Recently there was a blog that I saw from a man named Kent Anderson, who may seem anonymous to you, but he was one of the publishers at AAAS and was the founder of the Scholarly Kitchen, which is a place where editors and publishers turn to for advice on how to handle publishing. And he had some really nice written advice, which I unfortunately need glasses to read a moment of. And he says, "Wither the reader. A lack of focus on the reading experience is a glaring Achilles heel. In many fields and at many career stages, readers still respect, seek, and want a curated experience. They understand and appreciate how editors string together related content, surround important new research with editorial perspectives from respected peers, and set the pace and priority in a field, and create hierarchies of content to suggest consonance and dissonance among ideas. Given where they sit, the editors of Water Resources Research, by sheer volume, get quite a perspective, a unique perspective. 1,800 papers coming through this year and 1,600 in some of the years preceding, and it's been growing all through Alberto Montanari's term just previous to this. And because Water Resources Research is also a very respected journal for its rigor, we often get to see many of the best and some cutting edge ideas coming through as well. So it gives those authors, just by seeing the flow of things coming by, an interesting perspective. So today we're going to have 3 editor-author pairs. These editors are just in 3 of the fields that we have, so they're just some examples, and they've drawn from some of the highlight papers that they've seen this year and selected the authors to come up and talk about those papers briefly. And everybody's going to have 10 minutes to summarize these ideas or present their papers, and then there'll be 40 minutes of question and answer. For the question and answer, cards have been passed out to you for writing on. If you don't have a pencil or a pen, there are pencils available as well. Write your questions down as they come. For each of the speakers, the students will come by, just raise your questions while we're switching speakers and collect those. And those will be brought to Scott by the students, and Scott is over here. So the students, if you bring the questions over this way, that would be fantastic. And he will sort through those, and Jeff McDonald, the president of the section, who I'm sure will be here shortly, will gather those up. And if not, Scott has bravely volunteered to help moderate the question and answer session as well. To begin with, I'd like to introduce Alberto Montanari, the previous editor-in-chief of Water Resources Research, who's done a lot to help build this journal over the last few years. He's from the University of Bologna, and just for great opportunity for introduction, he was just elected president-elect of the European Geosciences Union, and was just awarded last night as Fellow of AGU. Alberto.
Thank you, Charlie, and the organizer, for organizing this session and inviting me. This is a great opportunity for me to make a synthesis of my experience as editor-in-chief of WRR, and I'm happy to do that because WRR is really close to my heart. And as I repeatedly said, this experience as editor-in-chief has been the best professional experience I ever had. So I'm particularly pleased to present this synthesis. And the first thing that I would like to say is that from 2013 to 2017, we indeed saw a change in perspective by the authors who submitted their papers to WRR, a change in perspective by our community. And I think it is very important to be aware of that and summarize how this change was developed. Basically, what we observed is an increased focus on interdisciplinarity, which means interconnected research by bridging disciplines in hydrology, but not only hydrology, in geosciences, I would say. And this has been a remarkable change that we had the opportunity to follow. And this implied a widening of spatial and temporal scales. and implied an interaction between the study of the interaction between different processes governing the Earth system, interaction between water, society, Earth, and biological systems, and implied a focus on feedbacks. This is a keyword of our experience during these 4 years. People tried to focus on feedbacks among different processes, and implied a focus on data, because we realized we are all aware as hydrologists that we need data in order to be interdisciplinary and to widen our spatial scales. And also we could watch an attempt to make synthesis and to develop community models. It's interesting to see the pies, the chart pies, because I would like to emphasize that if you look at the WRR publications, 90% of the papers are research articles, which means that it's not really true, as sometimes we claim, that there is an increase of commentaries and opinions. Again, 90% of the papers, the full body of WRR is research, which I think is a positive thing. In order to be interdisciplinary, we assisted a removal of traditional divides and categories. And I think this is the direction where we should move to. We should bridge what we considered before separated disciplines, like surface and surface hydrology. We have to bridge them. Deterministic and stochastic hydrology, let's integrate. Climate, meteorology, and hydrology, they are strictly interconnected, and research should focus on all of them in an integrated way. Hydrology, biology, and ecology, and in general, hydrology and geophysics. A nice perspective of these divides and how they evolved and were removed is offered by the paper by Ari Rajaram that is published on the 50th anniversary special issue. And basically, it's an attempt to draw the history of WRR. And we focus in this paper, in the conclusion, on the concept of coevolution that emerged during our term in order to foster interdisciplinarity. The 50th anniversary special issue was a great experience, and we started with the idea of focusing on 3 chapters: the legacy of WRR, future instrument and methods, and the future of our science. We ended up with this book that can be downloaded from the WRR website. It's a collection of papers that are individually published in WRR, and I think it offers an interesting perspective. I think it is an up-to-date reference on how our discipline is evolving. And when we try to summarize the content, we highlighted the importance of new monitoring techniques, global scale modeling, in agreement with the development that I mentioned before, coevolution again, and the characterization of heterogeneity. And we close the introduction with the hope that our research through this interdisciplinary approach may effectively contribute in the future to solving emerging societal issues that originate societal problems like migration and related tensions, which we could effectively contribute to solve. If we focus on the specific paper content, we observed a decrease of single catchment experiments. And for instance, climate impacts are analyzed now. The tendency is to analyze them at large spatial scales by focusing on data rather than models. We observed an increased focus on data sets. Data papers are numerous and highly cited. And during our term, WRR focused on emerging societal issues that you see listed there: the Millennium Drought, droughts in California, groundwater depletion, and others. And we could see an increased and renewed interest in the water-food energy nexus, and I'm showing here an example of 2 papers focusing on the virtual water trade. I think it's interesting to look at the highly cited papers during these years. If we look at the papers published in 2013, you see these are the 3 most cited. A paper focusing by Van Dijk and others on the Millennium Drought in Australia, as I mentioned, A review paper by Kit Bevan and German, macropores and water flows in soils, and a paper on groundwater depletion in the Middle East by Kathleen Voss and others. We are talking here about more than 3 citations per month. Usually we consider a good paper a paper that gets 3 citations per year, and you can really see that here the number of citations is impressive. If we go to 2014, these are the papers, data papers by Graham Vidon and others, presenting an interesting data set. A paper by Jeff and Kit Bevan, again, a debate, which was a news introduced under our term, focusing on travel time distributions, and a paper by DeLong and co-authors focusing on uncertainty in evapotranspiration and GRACE data again. GRACE has been a keyword during our term, very frequently used. In 2015, these are the papers, a paper by Alexandra Richet, again on GRACE, quantifying the renewable groundwater stress, a paper by Martyn and co-authors on process-based models, an emerging issue. As I said, the community model is an interest that is growing, and a review paper by a pool of excellent authors which were led by Andrew Binley, focusing on the other hydrogeophysics. These are my conclusions that I would like to summarize in 3 keywords: interdisciplinarity, data, open data in particular, and large spatial and temporal scales. And I would like to say that, in my opinion, we have to take into account and remember continuously that WRR is about water science. I think that the future of hydrology is to embrace the whole spectrum of water science. There are currently some topics related to water science that we don't deal with in WRR, mainly because they are not strictly related to geophysics, like water sanitation, water treatment. I think that our future should be to deal with the water science in a comprehensive way. I would like to conclude by thanking okay, and we are looking forward to the next 50 years, of course. I would like to conclude by thanking the editors who served under my term. Most of them, I'm pleased to say, are still serving, and these have been excellent co-workers, and now they are excellent friends. It has been amazing to work with them, and let me thank, with particular affection, the associate editor and reviewers. I estimate that I dealt with about 5,000 reviews in 4 years, and it's impressive if you think of the amount of work that our community puts in this journal, which means that is dedicated to research, to developing our science. It's really something that makes me amazed. It's a great value that we have to develop and profit from at our best. Thank you very much.
And again, the questions will come at the end as a panel amongst everyone. And Alberto brings up a good point that our community, the reviewers and associate editors, are there reviewers and associate editors in the audience? Just raise your hand if you're contributing. And yeah, thanks, all those up. Many thanks to all of you. And if you have questions that you wrote down after what Alberto had to say, thoughts that came to mind, write them down on the card, raise them up. The students will come by and pick those cards up, bring them down to the end of the aisle. Please hold them up, and they'll be collected down this way for Scott and Jeff to analyze. And if you find an empty seat in here, please step in here. Our next speaker is Jean Bahr with University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she does quite a bit of work with groundwater papers, and will be introducing an author that she's worked with that has produced a good example of a paper. And Jean, just this year and last night, was awarded the Ambassador Award for AGU, one of the very higher honors that AGU gives. So congratulations on that. And just as soon as I figure out how to use this.
Change it with that. Okay, so I was asked to give a perspective on papers in groundwater, and so I should give some disclaimers. First of all, there are 3 editors at least who deal with groundwater papers: Hari Rajaram, Zavi Sanchez-Villa, and myself, as well as many of the other editors. And so I only see carefully a percentage of those, and it's sort of hard to get a perspective. But what I tried to do in preparing this talk was to look back over the previous 12 months at about the time that the abstracts were due, and to try to say, well, what are some of the common themes that are emerging in these papers? So I did a little, albeit imperfect, metric of counting things, and my first page had probably 100 different categories, and then I kind of synthesized things down. I'm certainly going to miss some things. I think also my categorization doesn't really do justice necessarily to the interdisciplinarity that Alberto spoke to, but many of these papers, while I sort of put them in one category, in fact span many subcategories within groundwater and also link to other parts of the hydrologic cycle in the water system. So just to those disclaimers first. Okay, how does this, oops, how do I go back?
Is there a keyboard up there?
Okay, so this was my little tally in 2 columns. The first was what I did sometime last late May, and then just more recently I went through again for the things that had been accepted and published since then, and did another little tally to see if I was sort of in the right ballpark of what were the main issues. And so what I came up with was aquifer heterogeneity, and I'll say a few more words about each of these. Multi-phase flow, including carbon sequestration, groundwater, surface water, and hyporheic exchange, and Erich Hester, who's going to follow me, is actually going to talk about that in quite a bit more detail. Unsaturated flow and transport, including recharge, both spatial and temporal variability in that, flow and transport through fractures, remote sensing and hydrogeophysics at a whole range of scales, from the sort of satellite scale to laboratory experiments where you're trying to image things that are happening at the pore scale, coastal zone and freshwater saltwater interfaces, and reactive transport. So I hope that most of you that have published papers in groundwater at least see some of your science in there. Another way that I might have approached this would be to just look at the most cited articles, and so these are from the papers published in the last year, the ones that were groundwater, and I think this actually gives us some confirmation of some of those categories. The stochastic hydrology debates system, which was looking at the issue of heterogeneity and how do you characterize and model it, was one of the highly cited papers. Stream-bed advection and conduction heat fluxes, that's groundwater surface water interactions. Global evaluation of GRACE products is that remote sensing. And distributed temperature sensing and downhole hydrogeology is both hydrogeophysics and heterogeneity characterization. Another way to look at this would be to see what was most accessed in the past year. And this is kind of interesting because when you actually look at what was most accessed recently, it's not papers that were published in the last year. It's actually, some of them are a decade old. And that's actually consistent with some citation statistics for water resources research that say that the cited half-life for the journal is more than 10 years. This is very different from some of the emerging sciences like nanotechnology, where things get cited heavily for a few months and then you're on to the next one. But I think what we do in the hydrologic sciences actually has lasting value, and the fact that we continue to refer to things that were published a while ago is important. So. But then going to more specifically to these topics, I tried to look at the papers a bit and see what were some of the common themes in them. And there's a whole range of themes. So in the case of heterogeneity, we're continuing to develop better methods of hydraulic testing, tracer, and hydrogeophysical characterization. There's continued improvement in parameter estimation models using those data. I think an emerging picture of how important preferential flow paths are at a whole variety of scales. Merging geologic and geostatistical approaches, that those are not separate, but they're complementary. Just sort of reiterating that, the special section on lessons learned from the MADE experiments that appeared over the last year is a good example of the continued interest in and debates about aquifer heterogeneity. In the area of multi-phase flow, there's a range of applications from unsaturated flow, carbon sequestration, geothermal systems, all that require that we deal with these highly nonlinear kinds of systems. The papers span porous and fractured media. They include some really interesting pore scale visualization and simulation where we can actually look at processes now with new tools and understand them at those kind of scale, but also intermediate scale experiments and then also large scale field experiments that involve these kind of processes. And in that, the section that was published in honor of Earth Day and Science Matters and the March for Science, one of the commentary papers that gets at this theme was written by Mike Celia on carbon sequestration and capture as a large-scale carbon mitigation strategy. And to do that effectively, we really do have to understand these multi-phase flow processes well. In the area of groundwater surface water interactions, Erich Hester is going to talk a lot more about this, but I see a lot of interest in both spatial and temporal variations in hyporheic exchange. How does that impact the carbon, nutrient, oxygen dynamics in the hyporheic zone? What are the effects of channel morphology and bed forms and subsurface heterogeneity on those exchanges? And what kinds of tracers and other monitoring strategies can we use to obtain the kind of high-resolution data sets that allow us to disentangle those processes? And there was a special section on concentration discharge relations, which really focused on what do you see in the stream, but a lot of what you see in the stream in terms of those concentration discharge relations has to do with how the stream is interacting with the groundwater system, both deep and shallow flow systems. Unsaturated flow and transport and recharge, the spatial and temporal variations in recharge over short and long time scales, and how important in some areas highly episodic recharge may be in our water resources. Measurement and estimation of unsaturated hydraulic properties, solute and water fluxes through and storage within the unsaturated zone. Flow and transport in fractured media ranges from studies of what happens in single fractures to fracture networks to deep groundwater circulation through fractured bedrock. So this is a good example of the range of scales that we deal with. Also looking at the interchange between fractures and the porous matrix of the rock, and hydromechanical coupling that's involved in some of these fractured systems. In remote sensing and hydrogeophysics, we go from storage change estimates from satellites and airborne geophysical measurements to surface and downhole geophysical measurements for characterization of heterogeneity, geophysical monitoring of heat and solutes. And then groundwater in coastal zones seems to be receiving a lot of attention, and I think that's because so many people live in coastal zones, and the water resources in coastal zones are critical. There have been a number of sessions at this meeting on that topic. The studies range from trying to quantify submarine groundwater discharge and figuring out how much of that is fresh water from the land and how much of that is recycled seawater, and does that make a difference? Saltwater intrusion, how do we model it? How do we image it? Tidal, storm, and wave effects on freshwater, saltwater mixing. So looking at both, sort of short time scale and periodic sort of forcings. And then biogeochemical cycling in coastal and beach aquifers, and how does that, a lot of similarities with hyporheic zone studies in terms of how does that mixing induce the biogeochemical changes. Again, a commentary that came out as part of that series last spring on science, society, and the coastal groundwater squeeze by a number of both associate editors and frequent authors to water resources research. And finally, reactive transport. Lots of emphasis on pore scale approaches. We know that reactions happen at the very local scale, but we're trying to simulate them at a more macroscopic scale. So how do we scale up from the pore scale to what we see? Mixing controlled reactions, modeling approaches for complex kinetics, mobility of arsenic and other trace elements, but arsenic always gets a lot of public attention. And then how does porosity and permeability evolve as the result of precipitation dissolution reactions and biogeochemical reactions that affect nutrient cycling. So that's, I think I'm not too much over my time, and I will turn it over to the next person.
Wait, Gene.
Wait. Oh, okay, yes. So I realize I'm supposed to introduce Erich Hester. Erich is a researcher at Virginia Tech, a professor there, who does a lot of work in the Hyporheic zone. He's authored a number of papers that I've handled. In fact, I think the first paper that I accepted when I became an editor was one of Erich's. And he's also been an associate editor and handled lots and lots of papers for me. And he wrote a commentary about the Hyporheic zone this past year. And so I thought that would be a good takeoff place for him to talk a little bit more about that science in water resources research.
All right, thank you very much. People have told me I have a bad case of hyporrhea, so that's my qualification for this talk. How do I just click?
Mouse should work,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Jean, for that introduction and for inviting me to be part of this. And the commentary that she mentioned will be the focus of what I'm going to talk about today, but there's been a lot of other really interesting work going on in Hyporheic zone research recently, and so I'm going to highlight some of that as well towards the end. Okay, so this is the article in question, and I want to acknowledge the contributions of my co-authors there, Bianca Cardenas, Roy Haggerty, and Saurabh Apte. There we go. So the motivation for doing this work, why we wrote this paper in the first place, was this observation we collectively had that mixing in aquifers, deeper groundwater, is typically slow, often painfully slow from the perspective of remediation. Okay, but at the same time, there's this evidence that mixing is greater in the Hyporheic zone, particularly shown by fairly spatially extensive concentration gradients surrounding plumes and that sort of thing. The question then was what's going on there. There's certainly been some research in this, but it's not been fully explored. So what are the key controls on mixing in the Hyporheic zone? And I should really define here that mixing, in our case, can mean a lot of things, but here I'm specifically meaning true mixing is irreversible kind of mixing of two parcels or sources of water. So water like, for instance, solute dissolving or from a solute plume moving out into the surrounding groundwater. And so that's different from spreading, where you're just kind of stretching a plume or kind of fingering of concentrations into the surrounding water. It's actually the kind of irreversible mixing there. So, okay, so why this matters? Well, this session is about more than just Hyporheic exchange. So why does Hyporheic zone in fact matter itself? It's got a lot of unique in habitat there for specific Hyporheic organisms, but has a lot of effects as well in terms of nutrient cycling, pollutant attenuation reactions that tend to occur there, but not in surface water above or deeper groundwater. And within that context, why we care about Hyporheic mixing is that there's a lot of field studies that we don't know how to fully interpret. And the questions include where the Hyporheic flow paths, what reactions are occurring there, where along those flow paths are those reactions occurring, where are the reactants coming from that are allowing those reactions to occur, and how all this affects microbial communities. And so often we're trying to figure out what if several possibilities is going on. One is these mixing dependent reactions where, for instance, if you had DOC coming from surface water and you have nitrate coming up from deeper groundwater, you'll get the denitrification only occurring where those mix. So that would be a mixing dependent reaction. But we also know there's a lot of other things potentially going on. if you get entrained particulate organic carbon in the shallow sediment and you get these reaction microsites where with the nitrate advex pass there, you can get denitrification from that. And there's other processes as well. And so the study here by Conan et al. Is an example of a great field study, really interesting quality data there. And there was a PCE plume headed towards the river, and no degradation or not appreciable degradation in the upgrading aquifer, but once it gets near the surface water, you see the creation of these daughter products like the TCE and the DCE. So something's going on there, but which of these two things is going on, we don't know, and the answer to that really would come from knowing a little bit more about these mixing processes and figuring out exactly what's happening in more detail. So we move on from there to thinking about what are the actual things that could contribute to mixing in the Hyporheic zone. And we start with the processes that are going on everywhere in groundwater. So viscous shear in pores, tortuous flow around grains, these types of things ultimately help molecular diffusion do the real job of this true mixing. But there's other things going on in the Hyporheic zone as well, because it's close to that surface water boundary, which creates a lot of perturbations. Okay, so you have unsteady head perturbations and turbulence. These things impinge on the bed, so some unsteady behavior there. You also have heterogeneity that's created from a lot of the microtopography on the bed. So here's some examples of dunes that create these very curved flow paths. And then you also have the sediment movement from both the flow of the water, but also organisms that burrow into the bed and that sort of thing. So a variety of things that could potentially contribute to it. And you can also have places where you have what I would call fake mixing. So this is, for instance, in a heterogeneous or a homogeneous bed, you may have a plume with a fairly narrow mixing fringe on the edge. But if you sample it from these long well screens, you may get the image or the perception of a broad mixing zone if you look at the solid line in that middle graph here. But if you shorten those well screens, you would have a perception of a narrower mixing zone, although both of those are bigger than the actual one in this case. So there's a bunch of things that could create the illusion of mixing. So really we left this article with this idea of a hypothesis that we wanted to kind of put out there for other people to help us test. So certainly we think sampling artifacts are part of this explanation, but really the combination of this unsteady behavior or unsteady boundary condition that you get together with the heterogeneity in that Hyporheic zone, we think is probably what's going on. But there's a lot of interesting studies yet to be done to kind of confirm that and see how it varies from place to place. So our vision for future research in this area was really dive into this unsteady and heterogeneous question. But there's a lot of other things which tie into a lot of other themes that Gene was mentioning. So heterogeneity, preferential flow, soil types in riverbanks, these types of things, all I think need additional work. A lot of additional interesting studies that can be done in that. Another question is, if you have strong preferential flow, where does the advection dispersion equation break down and not necessarily work well for you, depending on what scale you're analyzing your data? And then just some basic data that are missing from the Hyporheic zone relative to deeper groundwater. Things like dispersivities and geostatistical data are much scarcer in that area. So this is just an invitation for people who are in this area to kind of dig more into this particular topic. So that was the idea behind the article. But at the same time, this has been a really exciting year or year and a half or whatever in Hyporheic zone science. And so I wanted to at least hit on a bunch of other things going on here. And again, many of these themes mirror what Gene was talking about earlier, but specific to the Hyporheic zone. So unsteady Hyporheic hydraulics was, there's been this really kind of groundswell of that over the last couple of years, which I think is really exciting. I think it's often one of the most important things going on in this system, but until recently there hasn't been that much study on that, so that's really great to see. The next two, sediment effects and spatial heterogeneity, kind of go together. The movement of sediment often creates the heterogeneity. And then climate change impacts. So there's been a number of interesting studies recently looking at how the Hyporheic zone can actually create greenhouse gases and how that can vary in time and space. Hyporheic restoration, the next one, that's kind of an application of Hyporheic zone science to stream restoration for various purposes. And then finally, instrumentation. So the Hyporheic zone, like all of groundwater, suffers from this problem that we can't just go look at it, right? So we have to measure it, sense it some other way. And that's often a challenge. but there's been a lot of work lately on how do we do that in an effective way, particularly in multiple dimensions. So some exciting work in that area. So I want to just show a few example papers in each of these three specific areas. So on the left there, the Shawai et al. This was an unsteady paper that looked at, how nitrification and denitrification are enhanced in riverbeds and riverbanks where you have hydropeaking going on, so daily cycles of power generation at hydroelectric dams creates this flux, daily cycling of the water levels in the river, and that propagates into the banks and apparently accentuates or accelerates these processes, which is pretty fascinating stuff. And then on the right there, Rao et al., there's not been a lot of studies on Hyporheic stuff as water levels rise and recede in ephemeral and intermittent streams, and this article does a great job of providing some ideas about that. Sediment effects, there's been a lot recently, both from the geomorphology community but also from the Hyporheic community, trying to figure out how does the sediment transport work together with the effects on the Hyporheic zone. So the top one here, Nunes, Gonzalez et al., sand infiltration. So sand infiltration or any kinds of fines, infiltration of fines is going to affect the hydraulic connectivity and all the processes that go in the Hyporheic zone, but where and when does that happen and how does that affect the Hyporheic zone is pretty key. And here they're showing the significant differences depending on whether you have the gravel that interlocks and provides the framework versus doesn't. So that was a pretty interesting study. The one at the bottom, Sinha et al. Was looking at how you get a difference in the surface water turbulence simply depending on whether you get the Hyporheic exchange going into the bed. And so if you look downstream of these dunes, you see differences in the vortices down there depending on whether you have this Hyporheic or permeable bed there going on or not. And then finally, instrumentation. Again, this is a real challenge typically for subsurface work, but a lot of interesting work going on here. On the left, a laboratory study, Kaufman et al., looking using a planar optode. So this is a kind of plasticky sheet you stick on the inside of your flume there, and gives very detailed, spatially highly dissolved oxygen maps. And there it's in comparison with a model. And then on the right, just some field, a few examples of field studies or field advancements. Drones have been used a lot in hydrology recently, and Hyporheic zone's no exception, looking at topography or water surface elevations, that sort of thing, thermal signals. And then finally in the bottom, just an example of geophysical technique, in this case electrical resistivity imaging, allowing us to get 3D images of electrical conductivity, which we can use to map onto subsurface heterogeneity or tracing of electrically conductive tracers or plumes, that sort of thing. So a lot of exciting work. Now with that, I'll let you guys read the citations, and thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Scott Mackay from SUNY Buffalo. And Scott has a long history of working with eco-hydrology, and worked with him on a session in the long ago past, doing some contrast with aquatic and terrestrial eco-hydrology, and it's great to have him up here again. And he'll be introducing another speaker following him talking about eco-hydrology. And as soon as I figure out how to... Scott. Oops, that one. We didn't have enough speakers up here.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, everyone, for being here for this session. So what I'm going to tell you is that what I spent some time looking at was eco-hydrology is sort of spanning a breadth of topics throughout hydrology. And so what I did was look at a period of 2015 to 2017 as a search. And I thought, well, it'd be useful for context to go back, since WRR has a long history of producing excellent work in sort of the connections between biology and hydrology. And if we go back to the 60s, the same period of 1965 to July 1967, you find 42 papers in WRR, 80 papers in AGU journals in general covering this topic. And then you can see the ratio there. So if you go down the list, you can see that the ratio of WR to all journals within AGU drops off, and that's partly because we have new journals coming online, JGR Biogeosciences, Global Biogeochemical Cycles. What's interesting is that when you get to the bottom, in this last decade, we started kind of bumping back up, and I don't know whether that means anything. Obviously, we don't have a trend yet, but it's kind of interesting to see that now we're getting, in this same period, roughly a quarter of the papers that are published on this topic are in WRR, at least those published in AGU. Whoops. Don't want to give away things too soon. But what I did was look at sort of eco-hydrology focused, and we can organize these things into these topics. So climate change, critical zone, vegetation and catchment dynamics, biology and stream processes, sustainable agriculture, turbulent energy fluxes, urban ecosystems, wetlands, peatlands, marshes. These are the kind of themes that you find. And you can see the citations. Some of these are, if we take a subset of the papers that are well cited over this period, the 115, over 1,000 citations already. That's a pretty tremendous number of citations. And what I perceive from looking at all of these papers is that there's a breadth of eco-hydrology. There's one editor at Eco-hydrology, but in fact, eco-hydrology spans the breadth of the discipline. And one way of thinking about that is we can organize it even a little bit more in terms of some cross-cutting themes. I'm stealing a cartoon that came out recently from Gordon Grant and Bill Dietrich put out a commentary, and this is a nice commentary. I love the cartoon. It's beautiful. It shows the effect of having the compressive forces and greater critical zone development in the ridge. And then the role of plants in this system, the roots are getting down into this and helping to develop the critical zone. But we have this idea of interfaces where it's what's going on at the boundaries of things that we really need to be focusing on, and we're seeing a growing interest in this. Coevolution, of course, Alberto talked about a little bit, is this idea that we can combine plants and other organisms along with the geology, the soils, the hydrology. All of these things are co-developing. And then the energy exchange, the role of the root system all the way up through to the atmosphere is the water movement and its role in the global energy exchanges. And just to give an illustration of some papers that came out recently, a review paper by Krauss and others, Eco-hydrological interfaces, is a nice, fairly accessible read into this idea. Coevolution, of course, Peter Trokes, now becoming a fairly classic paper discussing this, and then a really well-conceived paper on energy exchange by Roderick and others, really getting at the sort of reconciling some issues with global climate change. So what I'm going to do is look at some examples within each of these sort of themes. And I'm just going to take a couple of examples, some papers that really kind of popped out at me, and ones that have either good cartoons or really clear data. And so on the left is the Roderick paper, where what they're really doing here is reconciling the fact that in the geological record, what we find is that when the Earth is warmer, the atmosphere is also wetter, and that's been a controversy within the atmospheric science field. Of course, there are issues that there are regional differences, and there are effects of dynamic vegetation and access to groundwater that requires us to have a better understanding of the distribution of roots. But of course, this gets at least a global scale picture of things. And then on the right is a study that's now getting a very large number of citations of a bark beetle study trying to look at the effect of stream flow. Of course, the controversy here was that everybody thought that bark beetles would result in greater stream flow yield, but in fact that's not the case. These are energy limited systems, and when you free up the canopy, other organisms take over, right? More plants are growing down from underneath, and they consume the water. You get increased evaporation, right? Energy limited system, and the effect on stream flow is either minimal or actually decreased. So I encourage you to take a look at that paper. And then these two papers really get at this idea of these interfaces, and it's two different perspectives. One is on the left is really a clever way to make use of data that where you may not, it may be impractical or too costly to collect data continuously. So rather than, if you have grab samples, how are you going to make some sense out of it? And so these flow networks were developed to make some sense of the grab samples, taking into account where there are memory effects and so forth. And it's really a clever way of making use of instrumented data that are making use of data where you don't have instrumentation. And then on the right is, of course, really nice way, almost textbooky way of looking at how vegetation and catchment behavior behave. And so you look at the differences between conifer and deciduous species in catchments, and of course the change in the length of the dormant season has a big role on the flux storage relationship, how far you swing up that flux storage relationship, right? So how far you go up on here. And then in the third category, we have this co-development idea, co-evolutionary ideas. And on the left, what I'm showing here is a recently published paper that really gets at the heart of using relatively simple models, right? So we're looking at concentration discharge relationships. These are both on log scale. But what I really like about this cartoon is its organizing principle here, where when you're at low flow, you're really at biological control over the concentration of substances. And then when you're at high flow, of course, it's a hydrological control. And they did this analysis using a really low dimensional model. So really powerful use of a simple model with the data that they collected in the field. And that's really a critical thing here for advances in eco-hydrology, is keeping to those low dimensional models. And then on the right, it's a similar kind of study, except focusing on the effect of the hydrology, or more specifically on the connections in hydrology on biological control. So it's biological productivity in this case. So that when you sort of have this optimal location where you have just enough connectivity that there's a delivery of nutrients when the organisms need it. When you're at the low, when you're down at the low connectivity, they become limited, and at the high level, of course, you're flushing them out. And again, another really excellent study, and something that I would encourage people to consider is these really nice cartoons that are finishing up your papers that really illustrate the conceptual model that you've learned from your data. So just some general observations. The integrated role of biology and hydrology, I would say, is broadly integrated across water resources research. We are seeing some really creative methodologies for peering into some hidden processes, and roots play a key role in all of the cross-cutting themes that I talked about. And for that reason, I'm going to introduce this paper.
Before you do the direct, just ask them for questions again to write on the scraps of paper, because I haven't seen.
Oh, okay. make sure you're writing down your questions.
And students,
And-
raise them
And
up and pass
raise
them
them up, and students will come around and collect them.
If we don't have any questions down there, I'll call on people to ask.
And then Jeff McDonald is sitting up the front here, so they'll go to him. Okay? So I'll introduce this paper, and you can read the editor highlight this is sort of a summary of the editor highlight for this paper. This is one of at least 3 papers that Yuting has published in WRR recently that are getting really a lot of citations. This one is one of the newer ones and doesn't have as many citations, but after 1 year it already has it's already well into the double digits in citations. So any paper that's getting 10 citations per year is getting attention. So Yuting is at CSIRO. I would characterize him as an eco-hydrologist, but he works really at land surface atmosphere and has been doing quite a lot of interesting work on the utilization of optimization models to get a better understanding of global patterns of roots. And I won't go into too much more detail with his study. He can certainly give you those details himself. Thank you.
Jeff says we need more questions. We only have 3 so far, and he might call on one of you. So you might want to make sure that your friends and neighbors are getting questions up here as well. Just use that.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Very honored to be here to share our work, and thanks, Professor Mackay, for your introduction. My talk today is about rooting depths. So before I come on to the content, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, Dr. Randa Donahue and Tim McVicker, both from CSIRO Land and Water in Canberra. So why rooting depth is important? So because rooting depth is a key parameter in many hydrological and biogeochemical models, and it determines the active soil layer that plants can get water and nutrients from. But in current hydrological and biogeochemical models, the parameterization of rooting depth is largely dependent on the biome-dependent lookup tables, or just a fixed value across a global land area. This is primarily because the measurement of rooting depth is very difficult. These 2 studies summarize probably the most comprehensive collections of rooting depth observations. But in terms of hydrological modeling, the observation of rooting depth is somewhat not very useful, because these observations of rooting depths only represent rooting depth observations of a single tray or several trays. It does not represent the average or the effective rooting depths over a modeling unit, like a catchment or a grid box. So in this slide, here we adopt a carbon cost benefit model to estimate global rooting depths. This model was originally developed by Guzwa. So the basic idea was that any additional roots are associated with both carbon benefit and cost. So on one hand, those additional roots allows plants to access soil moisture at deeper layer, so to avoid water stress for longer time during dry spells and therefore achieve a greater gross carbon uptake. But on the other hand, the construction and the maintenance of additional roots also consume carbon. So there must exist an optimal rooting depth that balances the marginal carbon cost and benefit. So this is the results. The above figure shows a global pattern of mean rooting depths over the past 30 years. So as we can see here, in the majority parts of the globe, the rooting depths are quite shallow. It's lower than 0.4 meters. But along the tropical rainforest region, the rooting depths can be deeper than 2 meters. So here I'd like to highlight that the rooting depth estimate here is not comparable or is not the same as the rooting depth of a single plant. It considers both vertical depths of root plants and horizontal coverage of vegetation. So for example, in dry regions, we often observe a very deep roots in dry regions. But in those regions, the vegetation coverage is very low. So the effective or the average rooting depth is low as well. The below figure just a summary of rooting depths for each plant functional type. So the rooting depths also show a clear climate dependence. So those two figures shows that a deeper rooting depth occurs in areas where over a long time the water demand equals water supply, and also in areas where the seasonal water and energy cycle are out of phase. So in the above figure, we see a very interesting feature in the Amazonia, where the rooting depth is much shallower in the middle than the surrounding areas. So here we are going to zoom into this area to see the reason behind it. So over a long time, the entire Amazonia can be characterized as a humid region, and the vegetation coverage is also very high, so almost fully covered. So the rooting depths, the spatial pattern of rooting depths corresponds fairly well with the spatial pattern of dry season length. So the deeper rooting depth occurs in areas where the dry season is long. So this is reasonable because the deeper rooting depths generally indicated larger soil water storage capacity. So during dry spells, the plant can still access soil water that's stored in the soil to avoid water stress. So this is also a very good indication of climate adaptation of vegetation. We also compared our rooting depth estimates with other two existing global rooting depth data sets. So one by Clayton, based on an ecosystem optimality model, and another one by Shank, which is directly upscaled from observations. So we say our comparison with Clayton's data set agrees quite reasonably well. But our data set show a very different spatial pattern, especially in dry areas like in Africa and Australia. The reason behind it is that the Shank's data set is upscaled observation data set. So as I said before, for example, in Australia, the continent is very dry. So the measurement of the measured rooting depths can be very deep. But this data set doesn't account for the fact that the vegetation coverage in this area is very low. So this is also a very good indication that why upscaled from observations is not very useful in our modeling. To test the estimated rooting depths, we employed here a highly transparent hydroclimatological model based on the Bodico framework, where the Bodico land surface parameter is explicitly expressed as a function of rooting depths. So the validation results show that our rooting depth estimates exhibits a clear improvement in the estimation of evapotranspiration compared with the other two existing rooting depth data set. The similar improvement was also found at the Great Box scale when compared with the remote sensing-based ET estimates. So finally, I'd like to show this. So under a changing climate, especially the CO2 enrichment environment, this carbon-based or carbon cost-benefit model is also capable of capturing the CO2 effect. So here, with the increase of atmospheric CO2 concentration, the rooting depth is likely to grow. This is also in a broad agreement with observations. So what will be the hydrologic consequences of deeper roots that is resulted from CO2 enrichment remains a very interesting question to be answered. So finally, this rooting depth data set is freely available from CSIRO depth. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Yuting. Again, please pass questions down. I know that IHS is asking for the top 23 questions, but these are just shorter, simpler ones. They need not be that comprehensive. So please pass them. Just wave your hands and with the card in the air. If you don't have a card yet, there are at least 200 of them in the room. I vastly underestimated, so pass them. If you want one, find someone with a card. Our next speaker to introduce the topic of catchment hydrology is Ilja van Meerveld. Editor started this year with Water Resources Research, and she'll be introducing author from there, and she is from the University of Zurich. Ilja.
Good. So my name is Ilja van Meerveld, and as Charlie said, I'm an editor of Water Resources Research, but I've only been an editor since April, and it's been really nice. I've been asked to say something about recent advances in catchment hydrology. What I'll add to that is maybe some opportunities, or where I think the field is going to, or where I think that a lot of papers hopefully will be submitted to Water Resources Research in the coming years. Said that, of course, what I think are some of the recent advances and where I think the field is going, or where I hope papers will be submitted, is highly personal. And one of the nicest things of being an editor I find so far is that I get to read also a lot of papers that I normally maybe wouldn't see. And so if your topic is not part of what I list, that doesn't mean that it's not important. Please do send it still. But before we talk about advances and opportunities and where the field is going, I think we also have to address one major challenge. And that challenge has been addressed recently in several commentaries, and that's the decline of the number of field studies. Apparently, WRR in its first issue, according to Bahr and McDonald, had more than 50% field studies, and on average it's now less than 10. For example, if we look at the October issue of WRR, we see that there are maybe 2-3 studies that can classify something as related to runoff processes. So that's about 8%. If we look at the data there, on the left, the figure from Bahr and McDonald, looking in green, the number of field studies going up, and then potentially even slightly declining after the 2000s, and being a really small fraction compared to all of the other runoff papers that have been increasing way more. There's also been a survey of more than 300 hydrologists asking, is there a tendency for fewer experimental studies and more modeling and data mining projects? And the overwhelming majority of the people say, yes, this is indeed the case. And one of the reasons for that is that people think that field studies are more risky. You want to go out and measure runoff processes in the field and it doesn't rain, or you finally installed everything and a landslide takes your catchment stream out. And there is also the worry that it's hard to publish field studies, and maybe the reviewers think it's too much of a case study. On the other hand, we also really need field studies and more field studies because we need to understand runoff processes maybe more than ever in order to be able to predict what the changes are as a result of climate change, as a result of land use change. And in a way, our models are only as good as our observations and our understanding of processes. So in that sense, it's really that green bar needs to become a lot larger fraction of the gray bars. When asking people, what do you think has the biggest potential for advancing hydrological science, there we also see that knowledge that field studies are important, that experimental studies are important, comes back because the largest number of people say it's a combined effort of modeling and experiments, or ranked number 2, it's field-based monitoring. What we have seen, and maybe Alberto mentioned it a little bit in his start of the talk, is that there are fewer individual catchment studies. I would like to phrase that slightly different and saying that over the last few years, and maybe also a place where we see more and more, is that we see more catchment comparisons. We have lots of studies in the past. The problem is they're mainly dominated in the temperate climates. But we do see more studies not focusing on what do I see in my one catchment, but looking at differences and similarities between catchments. And from that, looking, what are the driving processes? How have these catchments co-evolved, which is something that we've also heard about all these other talks so far. I think one of the challenges, though, is that there may be, by having so many studies in the temperate climates, that there's a bias to these particular locations. And therefore, our process understanding and our models are also biased to these locations. I want to illustrate that here with a map of hill slope models, not catchment models, simply because there are fewer hill slope models, and where they have been tested or validated or applied. And we see that they've been really used for very few, a handful of locations across the world, and a lot of them at the same location. And we may wonder then, are these models really representing the entire globe? Are all of these hill slopes characteristic or not? But that brings us also back to one of the advances of what I think has been really great in the last couple of years. I think that there are more and more studies coming from the southern hemisphere, and that really starts to fill in that gap, and I hope that that continues. We also see more studies on catchments, not only headwater catchments that are nicely forested, but catchments with people in it, looking maybe at these processes like urbanization, land use change impacts that may not have been intentional, but are happening at the same time. And I think one of the opportunities that we really need to do as sort of catchment hydrologists is connect better to the land use change modeling community, because what we find in our land use change studies is really not being implemented as much as it could be in these models. While it's good to go to also other locations, it's also very nice to remember that we have these really nice catchments, these long-term catchments, where we have been able to do more interdisciplinary research, although the challenge is, of course, to keep them going. There we can build on knowledge from each other, do these interdisciplinary studies. Maybe the advances will come from this true integration of the top of the critical zone all the way down and not looking at only specific parts. We can do more repeated experiments at these locations, and indeed, as mentioned also before, do more of these landscape and catchment evolution studies. As Scott pointed out, I think also there has been a very big advance in understanding eco-hydrology, understanding where the water sources are for vegetation, and that the subsurface, mainly probably from these eco-hydrological studies, is not a single storage. And I think the advances, or where we may have to go in catchment hydrology, is by taking that information and also say, what does that then mean for catchment scale runoff processes if water is only being taken from certain locations or at certain times. That was the top of the critical zone. If we go all the way to the bottom of the critical zone, I also think that there have been quite some significant advances in the last couple of years in that perspective in runoff generation mechanisms and understanding. I think we much better appreciate the enormous amount of storage in catchments, and that it's a lot deeper than the dynamic storage. Much more appreciate that there is a lot of flow going through the bedrock, and that even that may contribute to storm flow during events. The maybe advances, or where I think we will see a lot of papers in the coming years, are where we quantify this storage, maybe linking to the critical zone weathering people. Maybe they can give us some really nice new sort of tracers that we can combine this. And I think what we should also do is link better to the hydrogeologist. Often our lower boundary in catchment hydrology is sort of the upper boundary for the hydrogeologist, and that's a very artificial boundary, and I think by working together there, we can really make some good advances, and that's maybe where we should go as well. Another advance has been the very high, with the new laser spectrometers having bigger and longer, more higher resolution isotope and chemistry measurements, using these measurements in models to explain ages of water. And maybe one of the opportunities is to having more now also in situ measurements, either for in the stream so that we can get even higher resolution data, but probably also by analyzing the soil water and the groundwater at much higher resolutions than we have done so far by taking one sample before an event and maybe one during an event. Then, as one of the last ones, looking at hill slopes, how they connect to streams. There has been a lot of talk in the last years about dynamic connectivity. How do different parts of the landscape connect to the stream, and when do they start to contribute water to the stream? I think the concept is really clear, but we can do a lot more by really using that concept in understanding runoff processes, studying connectivity a lot more. In addition, we also probably need to go find ways of how we go from point measurements to catchment scale patterns, and maybe we can link then looking at landscape patterns. One of the ways of doing that is by looking at changes along the stream network, in addition to looking at what's happening on the hill slopes. We see very large differences and changes in, for example, stream chemistry, the hydraulic connectivity, or the amount of stream flow along the stream network, and I think a lot of people are now studying these changes, and so probably we will see a lot of papers, hopefully, being submitted on these topics. And then maybe we need to really find ways of, from this information, interpret processes, find ways on how to use this information in our models. And that's a very good segue into why we chose the next paper as a highlight for WR on catchment hydrology. It's a paper by Nitin Singh looking at isotopic composition in base flow and how that varies. And particularly, here are some figures from his paper that you will hear in about 10 seconds, a lot more about. But why it was chosen is because it is observations, but also using a model and looking at why we see these changes and variability and trying to explain that and looking at what that means for the larger landscape scale.
Thank you, Ilja, for a nice introduction, and thanks to all conveners for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to talk about this work. And she gave away all actually my main figures, so I don't have much to say now. This is mouse.
Oops, I'm sorry. Yes, just the back button. There you go.
Okay. So should I hold this way? No, right?
So just set it down there, I think. That's where.
So thanks again to all conveners for inviting us. And so this work is, today I'll be talking mostly about the isotopic composition of base flow along headwater streams and how does it relate to catchment structure in general. So in the interest of time, I'll be skipping a lot of details and in background. I'm jumping straight to the research question. So we have done a lot of work in understanding the residence time, sources, flow paths in headwater catchments, but we still know little about the spatial patterns of isotopic composition along stream. How do these patterns change with antecedent condition? And more importantly, how these patterns relate to the internal catchment structure. So when I say internal catchment structure, I specifically mean the hill slope scale characteristics along the stream, the location of hill slope along the stream, and the arrangement of hill slopes along stream. So this work was done at Hydrologic lab, which is in western North Carolina. And this is you can see it's a watershed 1 and 2. They are paired watersheds, and they are south-facing low elevation watersheds. You can see red triangles along the stream. They are 25 meters apart. These are mesonoptic sampling points. The dark blue circles you see there, they are groundwater wells and transects. In watershed 2, they also show reflect soil water lysimeters at several depths, and 2 pink squares are actually precipitation gauges. So first, we actually did synoptic sampling, where we collected water from stream, groundwater, soil water precipitation for 2 years at monthly time scale along all these locations. And after that, we did dilution gauging measurement, where we estimated discharge and develop a discharge area relationship for all these locations, for all synoptic sampling dates. So we can actually use that to calculate the lateral flow in 018 for all these contributing hill slopes along the stream. And then we also delineated hill slopes along the stream to get the spatial characteristics of hill slopes. So this is our first thing we show as a isotope hydrologist. The first thing I like to show is phase diagram. That's where we begin. Here you are seeing blue circles, which are precipitation with your local meteoric water line. These are volume weighted. The green circles are stream water. The yellow squares are groundwater. And here I want to highlight only two things very quickly. First, you can see large temporal variability in precipitation compared to stream and ground. And also, if you can see, they are tiny, small tan square. They are saltwater samples. If you see, most of these samples actually, including stream and ground, they lie along meteoric water line. So this is just to say that we did not see much evaporative enrichment in these samples for the study period. So this is the isotope composition of base flow for the 2-year period. On the x-axis you're looking at is a space. So 0 is the outlet, where is the weir, and 700 is the channel head, and y-axis is time. Just gonna go back. And on the right, you see the hydrograph and hydrograph, where you have the red colored dots, which are actually sampling dates. And the color is the contour colors are your isotope composition. More enriched in 018 is redder, and more depleted in 018 is bluish. And if you see the dots on those plots, contour plots, those are actually my sampling locations and samples. So this plot represents almost 670 samples for the study period. And here is a lot to talk about, but only I'm going to focus on 3 things. First, if you start with the this is the dry period cavita. Where's the mouse? I can't see mouse, sorry. Here. So this is the dry period cavita. We can see this is where it's a growing season, it's pretty dry, and you can see the isotope composition is pretty depleted along the stream. And as you move in the water weir begins, you can see there's a large spatial variability, and you can see there is the isotope composition enriched 018 along several places. I also want to highlight one more thing here, that if you go, this is the period when cavita received is 80 to 90% of rainfall, annual rainfall in just 5 months. And you can see the streams are pretty much enriched throughout time and our sample. Now, if I compile this data in temporal scale, you can see that near channel head, you have a large temporal variability, but as you move towards outlet, your variability decreases, which is very commonly seen in these cases. Then we wanted to see how these patterns actually relate to the location of hill slope. Can we say something about the location? So we actually came up with our own matrix. We call it ICA, incremental contributing area, which is simply local hill slope area for any synoptic sampling point divided by the upslope drainage area. And we defined ICA. And what we found is the ICA on axis and Y is the temporal variability. The ICA was actually directly proportional to variability in the stream. So what does actually it means? So higher ICA was found actually in the upstream reaches where you have a relatively low amount of water in the stream. So hill slope has a higher potential to change the isotope composition of a stream compared to downstream reaches. We have a large amount of water in the stream. We also want to see how these actually, if you have an arrangement of such hill slopes, how that will influence the isotope composition. So here I'm going to show a little schematic about how we did. So we actually picked the month with a strong inversion pattern and try to arrange the So we try to arrange the arrangement. So we arranged the hill slope along the stream, and every time we arranged it, we actually using the lateral 018 observed values, we back calculate the stream 018 every time, and we did this like 10,000 times to see can we really simulate the stream 018 patterns for the given month. And what we found is actually these patterns were significantly different for the observed data. So one figure I didn't show here is actually the biodistribution of R square and slope for all these relationships. And what we found that the R square relationship for all these 10,000 simulations was significantly different. So it just basically tells us, so the way these patterns, the hill slopes are arranged, have a unique way to influence the spatial patterns of isotopes. And we may need to look harder, understand more how this influences in time. And with that, I will actually summarize. So we saw significant variability in base flow, and these patterns might be unique to these catchments. And there's a significant influence of the catchment structure. Although we have learned a lot, again, about the catchment structure, but most of the studies we have seen, they go from a catchment scale to subcatchment scale, but not much along the stream and looking at the hill slope scale structure. So we, as a community, I think, we still need to understand how the hill slope scale arrangement influences the spatial patterns of runoff in terms of quantity as well and quality. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitin. Our next and final speaker in the series here is Martyn Clark, the current editor-in-chief, just starting this year, and of course a long-term associate editor prior to that, from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Martyn. Oh, of course, we need your... Yeah, just hit that. You can probably get there faster. Just hit it. And again. And you're up here. There, Clark back. Down. No, no.
Perfect, thanks. So what I wanted to talk about today is where we think WRR is going to be going in the next 4 years. A lot of what I'm talking about today was mentioned in the introductory editorial that the editors and I put together that we published in Water Resources Research just a couple of months ago. So the main outline for today's presentation is to talk about the state of water resources research, to talk about the thrust to improve the quality and impact of WRR papers, the importance of highlighting and synthesizing major science advances, and then some of the key challenges that we're facing at the end. So in terms of the state of water resources research, what I'm showing here is the submissions to water resources research for the past few years. The different years are in colour here. So 2011 is in black here, going through to 2017, which is in red. What we're seeing is in 2017, there's a small increase in the number of papers submitted to WRR, maybe a 10% increase. A lot of that we think is due to the socio-hydrology special issue that CSIRO has been putting together, where there's over 100 submissions to that special issue. I think that's going to be a major event for WRR in 2017. CSIRO's done a fantastic job organising those papers. The major changes that I see in socio-hydrology in 2017 that there's more emphasis on the global scale, moving to the global scale, and much more emphasis on bringing in participation in socio-hydrology from people in other disciplines and really beginning to take advantage of interdisciplinary synthesis. We've also had an increase in the number of WR editors. We've moved from 8 editors to 12 editors. New editors such as Mark Birkins, who's got a focus on global hydrology. New editor Ilja, who talked just before, who is increasing the number of papers and interest in catchment-oriented field science. Jessica Lundquist, who's emphasising papers on snow, and I'll talk about a snow special section that we'll be having in a little bit. Part of this increase also is to the growth of science internationally. I wanted to talk just briefly about the review process. What I'm showing here are the papers that are submitted to WRR over the last several years. Sorry, I can't see the screen. Oh. Perfect. Yep. And I'm colour-coding these papers in terms of how the decision's being made. So the raw number of papers are on the top plot, and the fraction of papers is on the bottom plot. What we're seeing is about 40% of the papers are rejected without review. A lot of those are resubmitted. The change that we're seeing in the recent years is, in red is the rejections from the editor-in-chief, orange from the other editors, and green from the associate editors, is that the editors and associate editors are much more involved in the initial decline process. In terms of the overall outcome, 60% of the papers are ultimately rejected. You know, a lot of those are resubmitted, and we're seeing tremendous effort on the part of the associate editors and reviewers in really emphasising the importance of the work and really beginning to substantially increase the quality of the papers that are ultimately published in WRR. I want to talk a little bit about the work that's done to improve the quality and impact of WRR papers. The first two bullets that I've got here are really pretty obvious and don't probably need to be mentioned in this group, but I'm going to emphasise them. The key thing that we want to look for in WRR papers is that we want the papers to have really strong theoretical underpinnings. Right? We need to move from the what questions in terms of describing the results to the why questions. Why do we get the results that we have, and what broader implications do those have? Emphasising the general applicability of research advances. Focusing on the interdisciplinary challenge of hydrological science. I'll have a slide describing that and how that's evolving through time. We're beginning to work with the early career community. I'll talk about the workshop that I think many of you were at that we had on Monday, and the review process. So the slide that I wanted to show is this is for land modelling, where we're showing the evolution of land models over the past several decades. This is a slide that Rosie Fisher put together at ENCA, a figure that she provided. And what we're seeing for land modelling, and I'm going to make the parallel to other types of models in a second, is that in the 70s, land was really just an Earth system models was a lower boundary condition to the atmosphere, and as we've evolved, land is now a more integral component of the Earth system. So if we're looking at this, at the beginning, the models have had a specific purpose. The focus is on land atmosphere energy fluxes, limited representation of land processes and feedbacks. As time evolved, and you should be able to see the parallels with other models, and more focus on mechanistic modelling of land processes, but with the paradigm of properties-defined processes, right? So focus on short-term fluxes. So a lot of the soil and vegetation in these models is prescribed, and we're focusing on how the prescription of geophysical attributes is affecting the simulation of short-term fluxes. As we're moving forward, now as land is an integral component of the Earth system, we're interested in the dynamics of change, such as dynamic vegetation, and we're really moving towards the paradigm where processes define properties, where we're studying feedbacks and interactions across timescales. I'm throwing this up here because we see the processes that are included here, stomatal resistance, a big focus on vegetation and land models, gradually beginning to include more information on hydrology as we're moving through, in recent times more information on human impacts on the terrestrial system. And what we're arguing is that as we go through time, a lot of models are very similar in terms of the processes that are included where we are now. But their evolution has been different. So we see a huge opportunity for interdisciplinary synthesis and beginning to learn from other modelling communities as to the best way to provide reasonable process representations. Wanted to talk a little bit about the early career workshop on publishing. This is a photo from the workshop that we had on Monday. The young hydrologists are obviously an integral part of our community. I think, Jeff, you mentioned that the 50% of our community. We had this workshop on Monday, and we were focusing on the paper writing process, the review process, and then getting some guidance from the young hydrologists as to how we can begin to use emerging technologies technologies to advertise a lot of the recent science advances. It was very successful, and I think the young hydrologists are going to be writing that up, and we'll be sharing that with the community as we move forward. In terms of highlights and synthesis of major advances in hydrology, I mentioned at the business meeting that a lot of us feel now that science is under attack more than it has been in the past. You know, we've had a change of administration in the US. We're evolving through and beginning to understand how to operate in a new environment. And I think, and we all think really, that when we're moving forward, that we need to do a much better job than we have done in the past in emphasizing the importance of our contributions. A number of the earlier speakers have mentioned some papers in the Science is Essential collection. So this was something that was published in conjunction with some of the marches on science on Earth Day. One of the few first papers, first things that we did in our new team. And I want to really emphasise these papers because they're really taking what we've learned and showing the broader impact of the work for society. You know, we didn't want to take a defensive posture and worry about science and, you know, fight against change. What we really wanted to do is brag about what we've accomplished and really emphasise the importance of science for society. The first paper I'm listing here is by Jim Kirchner, Science, Politics and Rationality in a Partisan Era. A lot of you would have seen him give these remarks verbally during the Langbein lecture last year, and the way that he's put these together in the paper is really, really quite outstanding. Dirty Tetzlaff has written an excellent paper, really excellent paper, emphasising the importance of field science and how investments in field science have had tremendous societal implications. I think, Scott, you mentioned Gordon Grant's paper. Gordon Grant and Bill Dietrich wrote a paper, The Frontier Beneath Our Feet, emphasising the importance of critical zone science and the work that we're doing. Jean, you mentioned both the paper by Holly Michael, Science Society and the Coastal Groundwater Squeeze, and Mike Celia talking about geological storage of captured carbon. Bridget Scanlon published an excellent paper on the food, energy and water nexus and how we really need to understand some of the intersections between food, energy and water in order to understand the role of hydrological processes moving forward. Patrick Belmont and Ifi Fafula-Georgia, excellent paper on water quality problems in agricultural landscapes, talking about participatory modelling with extensive work with stakeholders to really develop models that can solve societal problems. Dennis Lindenmeyer published an excellent paper on observational breakthroughs to lead the way to improved hydrological predictions, and he was focusing on advances in land modelling for drought monitoring, as well as some of the new technologies that are emerging, especially LiDAR, to estimate high resolution estimates of snowpack. The final paper I wanted to mention was from Matthew Stern, Water and Life from Snow, and he did an economic analysis of the importance of snow in the western United States and showed the immense value it had and the importance of research in order to understand variability and change in snow resources. Coming up, we have a couple of excellent special issues that I wanted to highlight. Jessica Lundquist is leading an issue on advances in remote sensing measurement and simulation of seasonal snow. If you're interested in this, talk to Jessica and talk about how your work could potentially fit into this issue. Some of this issue relates to the SNOWX field experiment, but the issue is much broader than that. Praveen and Ifi have an issue on intensively managed landscapes. Praveen's here, over here, so if you're interested in that issue, then please talk to Praveen. Want to mention again, I'm not going to read these out, but celebrate the recipients of the Editor's Choice Awards. These were all presented at the business meeting and reception on Tuesday. They'll be on the WRR website, and congratulate all of the authors who have done outstanding work in 2016. To sum up, I wanted to emphasize a few key challenges. The challenges that we have, I'm just listing three. The first, I mentioned, changes in the perceived value of science to address societal problems. We need to do a much better job, I think, in terms of emphasizing the importance of the work that we're doing and communicating that to society. We're seeing explosive global growth in science over the past decade, greater need for international collaboration, greater opportunity to be able to use these international collaborations in order to solve some of the global hydrological challenges that we have. And finally, we're seeing a transition to a more diffuse publishing landscape. A lot of the good work that's being presented at AGU is often distributed across multiple journals. I think we're losing an opportunity for cohesion and synthesis that we have in order to take advantage of that great work and then push it forward into the future. So I'll end there, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Martyn, and we'll move from here to the question and answer led by Jeff. We'll moderate among them, so if we could have all of the speakers who brought us up to here come on up, and we will have the Q&A, and we'll hope all of you are running away afraid of being asked to ask a question.
I've got enough that I won't have to put anyone on the spot.
And great, I think we're good. Oh, I'm sorry, Jeff McDonald, the president of the hydrology section.
Well, as people are taking their seats, if you're standing at the back, there are some seats up front. You can make yourself comfortable. And in my, thank you. In my current role, it really warms the cockles of my heart to see a session like this. It's great to see our community and our journal thriving. All of us in the room abide by an unwritten contract that for every paper we submit, we're willing to review 3. This is what keeps our science going. But the folks we've been hearing from go well above and beyond that as associate editors, as editors, and I think their unselfish giving of time is really to be commended. I'd like to have a round of applause for them before we get going. Alberto. Pardon me? Alberto. Yeah, Alberto, can you come and join us up on the panel? Also, just a brief mention, I chaired the search for the editor-in-chief, and this was a very difficult position to fill given the large shoes that were being filled. We had 12 applicants. All of them were deeply committed to the journal, and I think we've made a wonderful choice, and many of the ones that were involved in that search and discussion are involved with the journal now, which really reflects the deep commitment. A session like this too, I think, is really important because when I was a PhD student in the mid-late 80s, I would go to the engineering library at the University of Canterbury waiting for the next issue of WRR to arrive. And the reason I was doing that was that I was caught up on everything catchment hydrology related. I was waiting for the next issue because I was hungry for the next paper. Now we live in a different world. We are drinking from a fire hose of papers. It's so difficult to keep up, and I think a session like this is helpful to kind of organize and understand where we're at. It was a more innocent time. I remember following Scott Mackay's advice, having a conceptual model. Mine was, the conceptual model is called the crack pipe model. Now that has a very different connotation to what it did in 1990. It was a kinder, gentler time. Now we hear not only about fake news, but fake mixing. We heard in the Hyporheic zone modeling. So I'm going to open up for some of the questions. I've got quite a handful here. I'll try to do it a bit thematically. If you've got a question you're wanting to shout out, that's cool also. So wave your hand. And I might just start out with a more general question for the panel. Is there still a place for empirical observational studies that don't involve modeling, i.e. case studies? This, I think, is a question I hear many editors from many journals saying if if it looks and smells like a case study, it's rejected without review. And I'm wondering how the panel might react to this first question that was posed.
I'll take a start on that. I think that what we reject are case studies where the conclusions are all very specific. This is what we saw in this system. I think several of the talks talked about the importance of data, and we need those field observations, but we need to go beyond just saying this is what we saw to making some interpretations. Now, those interpretations don't need to necessarily be a numerical model. They can be a conceptual model, but there has to be a synthesis of those data into an advance in understanding of processes, or perhaps saying these data are completely the opposite of what we expect. If there's really a set of data that challenge our existing models, I think that would be something that we'd be really happy to publish as well. But it has to make that case. It can't be simply we've got a really rich data set here.
Yep. Yeah, Martyn, did you want to make a quick comment?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're interested in taking the observations and then taking the next step as to, well, what have we learned from this study that's more generally applicable. So there's many cases where a lot of measurements in an individual place do provide us with greater process understanding and have the applicability that's necessary in order to advance science in general. The question that we often ask is, well, to what extent are the insights from your study useful to people working in other basins or other regions?
Yeah.
And that needs to be very clear in the paper.
Yeah. Yes, Scott.
How do we turn this on? Oh, it is on. I would just add that, if it's an empirical study, presumably you've got some kind of conceptual idea of what it is you are going to be measuring, what you're looking for. And so it's really hard to say that you're going to do an empirical study and not have anything to do with modeling. You've got something in the sense of a model. When you do the analysis of your data, you're doing some kind of model. And so I think there's definitely a place for a wide range of empiricism all the way to theoretical. I would argue that we probably see more papers rejected that lack empiricism, that really focus too much on models without the empiricism, and far fewer papers rejected that have empiricism.
Yeah, Alberto, yeah.
Yeah, it's very quick, and it's an anecdote. When Mark Parlange started as editor-in-chief in 2004, the first question that the audience asked him in a meeting was, do you take case studies? So I think it is indeed relevant. It is a relevant question. I would say that WRR takes them. I would say that there are several other journals that can take case studies, depending on the purpose and the focus. And my suggestion is, if you are in doubt, just contact the editor. I can say that because I'm not editor anymore, but I'm pleased to say that I was contacted several times by authors that were in doubt, and this is my suggestion. I think it's the good way to move forward.
Here's a question. Along similar lines, it's related to meteorological reanalysis. So it now provides data in quotation marks, and the person writing the question says, sorry, Bob Hirsch, if you saw the Langbein lecture. But this meteorological reanalysis now provides data at 4-kilometer scales back around 40 years. What are the issues in using these data to reconstruct watershed behavior and models in gauge basins? It's a whole new world of 40-year field experiments. Any reflections on that, good or bad, or are you agnostic on this topic to the panel, I guess? Maybe the pros and cons of perhaps of using more and more this reanalysis data as data? Is there a concern?
Yeah. It's a really good question, and the question is how far do you go down below the surface and what you trust from these reanalyses? A lot of these meteorological reanalyses that are being talked about make some ad hoc corrections to the hydrological states and fluxes, so a lot of that information, cannot really be used. So we need to be careful. But these are data, or forms of meteorological reanalyses are data that we can use to drive our models on continental scales, right? If we're doing continental domain hydrology or global hydrology, we can't rely on the gauge observations. At some point, there's some model, whether it be a statistical model, numerical model, merge of the two, that we use to translate the actual measurements to the computational units on our model in order to do the work that we're doing. A key issue, I think, is the uncertainty. A lot of the meteorological data or the meteorological reanalyses that are being used to force continental domain models are viewed as deterministic realizations of reality. And, really that's not true. There's a lot of uncertainty in these, especially in mountainous regions, that needs to be characterized explicitly when we're really trying to understand large domain simulations of hydrological states and fluxes.
Good. Here's a question. It could be written by a disgruntled author. I'm not sure. Dear Dr. Clark, it's usually a good giveaway for the tone. Why were there 3 reviewers for the first review, but 4 reviewers for the second review? I guess of my paper. So this is presumably a paper that was sent back with major revisions, and those major revisions warranted re-review, but there were more reviewers the second round than the first.
This is a more general question. Generally, we try to keep the same reviewers, but often in the review process, an issue is raised that needs an independent assessment, that we need somebody to come in the second round to provide their expertise that was not provided on the first round. Alberto, would you like to follow up on that as well?
No, I think I confirm. We tried also in the past to avoid calling new reviewers in the second step, but sometimes it becomes necessary. And also, there is to say that sometimes some of the previous reviewers are not available. It's a technical problem. So we have to look for someone else. And when we invite people, it may happen that they both accept the invitation, and therefore we don't want to decline the willingness of potential reviewers. Mm-hmm. Of course, we always tried, and I'm sure that even now they try to make a balanced assessment. We take into account that it's a new reviewer, and we try to support the authors in case of doubt. This was the general behavior, and still is.
I'll just say one more thing. My record for reviewers is 12.
Okay.
And the real purpose of the review process is to help improve the quality and caliber of the papers, right? So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to provide constructive guidance that can really help people lift their game.
Excellent. Well, this questioner then is greatly relieved. They only had 4 in the second review. Maybe a very, very brief comment about reviewing. I think for early career people, it is an incredibly powerful activity to both improve your research and to be engaged in the science enterprise. I remember as an early career feeling overwhelmed with tasks that were coming my way. And I talk with early career folks now. I have a colleague in Saskatoon, Saman Razavi. He really put his heart and soul into many of his reviews in his first 2 years as an assistant professor. He's now an associate editor on 2 journals. So I think the thing that early career folks don't necessarily realize is that the quality of your review, if it's a very high quality review, I would say, and I look to the panel here, take notice of that. They're making notes. They're always on the lookout for associate editors who are really dedicated. They're publishing good papers, but they take the job of reviewing very seriously. And that's how people get appointed to editorial boards and associate editorships. So I might just throw that out there because I think in discussions I've had on early career mentoring, that's a really important message, particularly for early career folks that are launching and wondering how this whole murky business of science works. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that on the panel. Or a head nod, one way or the other.
I'll just add that we do pay attention, and we also pay attention when people give really weak, poor reviews, like thin, and late, and we keep track of these things. And so we generally, when I was an associate editor in particular, I would keep detailed notes on reviewers, and I'd say, really, really good reviewer, or don't go back to this one.
Yeah.
I'll just say something else as well. It's been amazing, these last few months being editor-in-chief to see the whole scope of the journal and like the amount of community engagement that we have and WRR is just incredible. The quality of reviews that we get, sometimes just knocks my socks off, right, as to people who've really bent over backwards, to help the authors improve the work. The sterling efforts of the associate editors, I think now we've got 130 associate editors for WRR, really like turning themselves inside out to provide the best guidance possible to the authors. And, every time I see, like 3 really high quality reviews and great synthesis from an associate editor, I'm very grateful to the work that the community's doing to lift the standards of the entire discipline.
Excellent. Okay, here's a question, and I think these humorous ones come from my president-elect. I'm not 100% sure. So we've had 10 years to rest and train for nuclear waste in Yucca Mountain. In this climate of downplaying of science and engineering, have we been going to CrossFit, or have we been sitting on the couch eating a bag of Cheetos? Interpret as you see fit, I think.
Discuss.
It's probably directed to me. Why don't we have a beer? No, I think there was a lot of really groundbreaking science that was done in looking at Yucca Mountain as a potential site. I think the future remains unclear for both political and scientific reasons. But I think there's still a lot of interesting things to learn from what's going on in the international community. Finland is starting to construct a repository. Sweden and France are getting closer to licensing things. So there's a lot of different geologic environments that each present their own unique characteristics and their own scientific questions, and there have been a number of that's motivated a lot of the work in subsurface hydrology and reactive transport and fracture matrix diffusion, and probably will continue to do so. But what's happening in the United States is probably going to continue to be driven by political preferences.
Yeah.
I think the reason I was asking that question is a little bit of a call to our community that this is an area that, as hydrologists and hydrologic engineers, we should be involved with. We need to be at that table, and to shy away from it, I think, is neglecting one of our social responsibilities. That's the source of that question.
Yeah. Good. There were many, many questions in the pile about the rooting depth presentation, which was really fascinating, and then the general eco-hydrology subject. If I try to, group them, this might be for Yuting or might be for Scott. Can you talk about topographical influence on roots and what that might mean for groundwater surface water interactions? Or, in other words, can you get at rooting depth patterns without explicitly including topography, even at large scales? I asked this because I think this is, related to a lot of work that's been published recently in Science and elsewhere, trying to look at links between transpiration and groundwater, downslope, down catchment subsidy, and I think, you know, and Yin-Fang Reinfelder's global syntheses that have kind of highlighted the topographic effect. It's rather pointed topically, but I wonder if Dr. Yang or Scott want to comment, or anyone else?
Well, I'm just to make it clear, I'm not really a guy who spend my entire research life into root study. So for that study, so basically, I think the one I presented here is about the balance between water and carbon. So if topography affects any of these factors, it would affect the rooting depths. But here I'm looking at a very large scale, so the topography effect will be largely diminished. So I'm not quite confident to answer that detailed topography or terrain effects on the rooting depth. So maybe.
What I would add is that it can be convenient to try to think that topography will give us a nice relationship with root depth, but in fact you can have systems where root depths increase with as you go down the slope, and then they can decrease as you go down the slope. And so there are a lot of complicated factors. There's a lot that we don't know. Obviously, the role of rooting depth it depends a lot on species type, depends a lot on how vulnerable those plants are to cavitating. It depends to a large extent on the depth of the roots, whether the roots are able to get into cracks in the bedrock. There are quite a few variables that are below the surface that really are somewhat unrelated to the topography we see at the surface. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot that needs to be done there. This is an area that has potential to be very exciting for the future, but it requires a lot of work.
And maybe just to editorialize a little bit, you know, the most important questions in our field are often the simplest ones. You know, how deep does rainfall penetrate in a soil profile? How old is the water in the stream? Such basic questions that anyone in society can grasp, but to answer them scientifically is so difficult. And I think also in this era of churn of papers, you know, we lose track of the need, like some of our hydrological forefathers and foremothers, to walk out to the edge of our discipline and look where, you know, no one has tracked before, the fresh snow that no one has explored, and to be thinking about that in the papers we're, you know, generating and submitting. Let me bring us back to something more general in relation to WR. How can we improve the translation of WR research to more applied hydrology, i.e. government regulation, investment, consulting practice? Maybe that's tech transfer, I don't know. Is there, you touched on that maybe a little bit, Martyn, with some of your activities, but I think this is something that many people wonder about and care about.
Yeah, it's funny because we were just talking about similar topics at our editorial board meeting on Wednesday morning. And we were discussing the fact that, you know, well, you call the churn of publishing, you know, everybody's focused on outputs, and we lose sight of the outcomes. Right? We lose sight as to what have we done as a community that's really, really beginning to make a difference. So what we talked about doing was, and I'll bring it up here to see if we can stimulate some discussion maybe in the hallways, people can marinate on a little bit, to look back over the past 20, 30, 40 years and think, well, you know, what have been the major advances in hydrology that are having a huge societal benefit? Right? And do some forensic work on those. So it's not going to be one paper, it's going to be a body of papers, and say, well, how has the science evolved? Right? And what was the non-linear process that led to those discoveries? which is going to be very different from the crisp papers that are published, which is where you had this hypothesis, we tested it, and here's the result. What were the surprises? What were the problems? Like, what really made us think? How has our work been used in ways that we didn't anticipate when we were doing the work in the first place, and really beginning to take that forth. WRR has got a very special place in science, so the papers that are more on the applied side are probably going to be better suited in other journals, depending on the scope. But what we have as WRR editors and as a community, we have the responsibility to do the synthesis and really show, what are the major science advances that have been accomplished and how these are being used for society, and what's the potential societal value of the work that we're doing.
Mm-hmm. And the centennial perhaps as an opportunity to maybe feature that and incorporate that into something special with WRR. Alberto.
Yeah. This is a very relevant question that is being discussed at the AGU level, and also EGU is discussing on this. And I have been involved in several meetings where we tried to devise strategies to get to target. I have a personal opinion that is related to the value of interdisciplinarity, and in particular the connection with engineering. I think we have to profit from this connection between hydrology and engineering. Sometimes I see authors that neglect the value of engineering, like in applied science. I think that the value of engineering is that of establishing a connection. Second, on a more general level, let's take into account that science and nature, they are very effective in getting attention from the press and the government and administration. It's not just a matter of high impact factor, it's a matter of strategy. So let's learn from that. This is something that we should learn, how they are successful in getting attention. They are indeed, and again, it's not related to the impact factor, it's a writing style, it's a strategy of communicating with our stakeholders.
That might require a statement from the editor or the editorial team to somehow encourage that, because I guess still there's much of the community that thinks, well, WR papers have to be theoretical, have to be major advancements. I'm writing it for my, the usual suspects. And I guess maybe this has been discussed, but maybe we need to discuss more. I don't know, the critical importance of that kind of communication. When you write a Nature geoscience paper or a high-level paper, it's written for a chemist, a biologist, uptake by a wide array of scientists. I don't know how we cope with that in a specialist journal like WRR.
It's simple. WRR has got many different paper types. Yeah. Right, and the research article paper type is what, as Alberto mentioned, the most popular. And that's where the research advances are provided. The commentary paper type, I think, is an excellent opportunity to do what you're talking about and what we need to do. So the key example that I like to give again and again is the science is essential issue. Right, those were all commentaries, and to provide one specific example, the commentary by Matthew Sturm on Water and Life of Snow, $1 trillion science question. Yeah. That got tremendous circulation throughout the DC area in the US, and is really beginning to shape, the future science priorities for snow science.
Okay, thanks very much. We're 2 minutes over time, I believe. We're scheduled to end at 12:20. I don't know, Charlie, if you want to say a wrap-up comment just to bring us full circle to where we started at 2 hours ago.
Many thanks to the panel, of course, and I think socks knocked off on this series of curation, the scope here seen by these folks, that story at the beginning from that sort of Uber publisher, and very much reflected here, and I hope you appreciate the connections and have a chance to visit with them, and many thanks again to the panel and Jeff.